Hi everyone, in this video we are going to be talking about speciation, which is the formation of new species. And recently we've been talking about evolution and natural selection, and so you can probably imagine that over the course of many, many generations, you could get a group within a population that sort of splits off or branches off and develops its own unique characteristics that are different from other members of that group. And if this keeps happening over time, maybe eventually those two groups will be completely different species. So we'll be looking at different ways that this can happen in this video. When we're thinking about species, I think we'll start by talking about what is a species. How do you know if one population is a different species from another population? And for some organisms, this is really obvious. I think we know that humans are a different species than bears, and bananas are a different species from E. coli, right? There are some situations where it's just really obvious that they're completely different species. But it's not always so clear cut, and the same sort of obviousness is not always going to be in play. So if you look at these two lizards, it might not be clear whether they're different species, or maybe they're the same species and one is just a male and the other is a female, right? So how do we define what counts as being two different species? There's not one definition that's going to work in every single situation, but the one that we're going to be using for now, and I think probably the most common definition that people use for determining whether two species are different from one another, is called the biological species concept. And this concept all has to do with the production of offspring. So the biological species concept says that species are groups of interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. And so this means that species, to be considered the same species, two populations have to be able to mate and produce healthy, fertile offspring, whereas they wouldn't be able to mate and produce healthy, fertile offspring with members of a different species. So with this definition, you could think of things like organisms that maybe look a little different, so like different breeds of dogs can produce offspring together. So like this beagle and this pug would be the same species because they can produce hybrid puggle offsprings with one another, whereas something like a fox and a wolf would be different species because they can't produce healthy, fertile offspring together. You could think of maybe this definition isn't always going to work. So for organisms that reproduce asexually, like bacteria, then this isn't going to apply. For anything that is a fossil or like species that existed only in the past, we can't use this definition either. But this will be the working definition that we're gonna go with for this class at least. Okay, so if we're thinking about all of speciation and being considered the same species having to do with the ability to mate and have offspring, then the next question that we could ask ourselves is, what is it that would cause speciation by preventing certain groups from breeding with each other? So what could prevent groups that maybe were similar from breeding with each other? And we'll be thinking about a lot of different kinds of traits that can cause this sort of barrier. And the word for these barriers is a reproductive isolation mechanism. And a reproductive isolation mechanism is just any sort of characteristic, and it can be any sort of characteristic that prevents successful reproduction. And these characteristics can be physical or something to do with the actual shape or structure of the organisms. It can be behavioral, so something about the way that they interact, or it could be functional. So it could be something molecular. There's all kinds of different barriers or reproductive isolation mechanisms. And we'll be thinking about sort of two main subdivisions of these reproductive isolation barriers. And those divisions have to do with whether the barrier occurs before fertilization, whether the barrier is something that prevents fertilization from happening. And so these are called prezygotic, because a zygote is the word for a fertilized egg. So if it happens before a zygote is formed, then it's called a prezygotic isolation mechanism. And this would be something that prevents mating, or if mating does in fact happen, it would prevent fertilization of the egg by the sperm. The other option is that sometimes we actually do get the production of a zygote. So the problem occurs somewhere after that. And so in this case, we call it a post-zygotic isolation. And this is going to be fertilization does happen, but development after that is not successful for some reason. So our next two slides are just going to sort of dig a little deeper into what kinds of factors we might consider for prezygotic and postzygotic isolation mechanisms. Okay, so for prezygotic, there are a lot of different kinds of things we could consider. But again, the prezygotic is going to be happening if it prevents successful reproduction from taking place. So this would be mating or preventing fertilization. So one thing is that you could have a temporal difference in the time where these two organisms or populations are looking to mate. So you could think of one one population being ready to breed either at different times in the day, so one wants to mate in the daytime and one wants to mate at nighttime, or different seasons. So maybe one is just ready to breed in the spring and the other one's ready to breed in the summer. And you can see this with even like right now, there are a lot of trees and shrubs that are starting to flower. And so those trees and shrubs are looking to spread pollen right now. Whereas we also know that there will be a lot of other trees and shrubs that'll flower later on in the year. So later in the spring or in the summer. And so the matchup for when those plants would want to mate are different. Even if organisms are ready to breed at the same time, they might have different mating rituals that would prevent them from being attracted to one another. So a lot of songs or dances or different courtship sort of rituals are required in order for successful mating to take place. And if a bird has a different song than another group of birds, then they won't be attracted to one another and mating won't happen. We also can have habitat differences. So if organisms just don't come into contact with one another because they live in slightly different places, then that would prevent mating as well. So you could think of organisms where maybe one is living higher up in the trees and the other one is living sort of, down closer to the ground. Or you could imagine that one is living in more of a forested area and the other one prefers to live, like in the water in the forest or something. If they just don't come into contact with one another, then mating won't happen. We could also have mechanical differences. So in order for mating to happen, you have the bodies of the two populations have to be physically compatible. And if this isn't the case, then mating won't occur. And this is especially the case with a lot of insects because they have those hard exoskeletons. So the sort of pieces have to fit correctly, like a lock and a key to fit together just precisely in the right way. And then finally, even if mating actually does happen, the gametes of the two populations have to be compatible. So sometimes the sperm and the egg just won't fuse together because they don't work with one another. The receptors don't work together. So all of these 5 different things could cause prezygotic isolation, where we're either just not going to get mating, or if mating does happen, we're not going to get a fertilized egg. On the other hand, we could also have post-zygotic isolation, and this is going to be where we get a fertilized egg, but something about that fertilized egg just doesn't develop correctly or not, it's not healthy. So the 2 main things here are going to be reduced hybrid viability. So this would be where you get a hybrid offspring, but it's not going to develop to reproductive maturity. So it's just, it could either not make it to term, so it would die in utero, or it could die early on in development. The other option is that we get reduced hybrid fertility. So maybe we get a hybrid, but it's sterile. This is the case, I think, most famously with mules. You get a mule by crossing a horse with a donkey, and they're really useful animals. You can carry around heavy loads, and they're useful in that sense, but you can't mate 2 mules together. You have to just keep crossing horses and donkeys to get them because the mules are sterile. So it's a healthy hybrid offspring in the sense of its own sort of physical health, but it can't make more mules. So reduced viability of the hybrid itself, or you get a healthy hybrid, but it's sterile or has reduced fertility in some sense. Okay, so that's our first video to sort of introduce speciation. And in the next video, we'll be talking about how this happens, like what can be ways where we get this reproductive isolation. And I'll see you then.